They cuffed him in broad daylight for a theft he didn't commit, ignoring his ID and proof of purchase. Little did the officers know they were humiliating the state's new attorney general. What happened next destroyed careers and sparked a movement. But let's start from the beginning. The city was already awake, its streets alive with the hum of early morning traffic and the rhythmic beat of hurried footsteps. Inside a sleek jewelry store, its gleaming glass displays shimmering under soft golden lights, William Harper walked in with the air of a man accustomed to respect. At 34, he exuded confidence, a tailored navy suit hugging his athletic frame, polished leather shoes clicking against the marble floor, and an understated gold watch gleaming on his wrist. He was there for a special reason, a custom diamond-studded necklace, carefully designed for his wife, to celebrate their anniversary. Outside, 2 white police officers loitered near their squad car, scanning the quiet street. Their eyes narrowed as they noticed William. His poised demeanor and the affluence of the district didn't align with the prejudices etched into their minds. They exchanged a glance and a silent understanding. As William disappeared into the store, their suspicions solidified. Inside, William greeted the clerk warmly, handing over his ID and meticulously checking the necklace's details. The transaction was professional, smooth, and uneventful. But the officers had already entered the store, their presence abrupt and heavy. The air turned tense as they approached William, their voices sharp and demanding. "We've received reports of suspicious activity in the area," one officer announced. Without waiting for a response, the other officer pointed to the necklace box in William's hands. "Let's see some proof you didn't just take that." William, his calm demeanor unwavering, handed over the receipt and ID he had just used. The clerk, visibly flustered under the officer's scrutiny, stammered as they questioned her. Sensing hesitation, they ignored her attempts to clarify, turning back to William. "Hands behind your back." A crowd had begun to gather outside, murmurs growing as William, now in cuffs, was dragged out. His jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with restrained anger. Standing tall despite the humiliation, he muttered, "You'll regret this," before being pushed into the squad car. The dimly lit interrogation room was suffocating, its bare concrete walls amplifying every sneer and condescending remark from the 2 officers. William Harper sat calmly at the metal table, his wrists still bearing the red marks from the 2 tight handcuffs. Across from him, the officers leaned forward, their postures aggressive and accusatory. "We know your type," one of them spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "Flashy suit, smooth talk. Bet this isn't your first time running a scam like this." William's jaw clenched, but his voice remained steady as he replied, "I told you, I purchased the necklace legally. The receipt and my ID are in your hands." The officers dismissed his words with a wave. "A likely story," the other officer said with a scoff. "Maybe you've got a nice little ring going. Your boys steal the goods, and you show up to make it look legit. Too bad you're not as slick as you think." They ignored the evidence William had provided, their bias blinding them to the truth. One of them smirked. "People like you don't shop in places like that, unless you're up to no good." Meanwhile, in a bright, bustling office across town, chaos was unfolding. Danielle, William's sharp and resourceful assistant, had just received a frantic call from a colleague who'd seen the arrest. "William? Arrested? That's impossible," she exclaimed, her voice tinged with panic. She immediately dialed the precinct, but her calls were met with curt responses and dead ends. Frustration mounting, Danielle began reaching out to media contacts. Within hours, the story of a black man arrested over a baseless theft accusation had reached the city's press rooms. Reporters, already intrigued by William's recent appointment as the state's attorney, swarmed the precinct, their cameras flashing and questions flying. Back in the interrogation room, the officers remained oblivious to the storm brewing outside. They had no idea that the man they were accusing was not only innocent, but held one of the highest legal positions in the state, a revelation that would soon turn their world upside down. The precinct, once quiet in the early hours, had become a hive of tension and activity. Phones rang incessantly, voices echoed in urgent tones, and the growing crowd of reporters outside created a palpable pressure. The police chief, a stout man in his late 50s, with a no-nonsense demeanor, stormed through the precinct with a scowl that parted the sea of officers like a tidal wave. Bursting into the interrogation room, he froze momentarily as his eyes landed on William Harper. Recognition dawned immediately, draining the color from his face. "Uncuff him immediately," he barked, his voice sharp enough to make the two interrogating officers flinch. The officers exchanged bewildered glances, but obeyed. One fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling, while the other stammered. "Chief, he was—" "Now," the chief interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. As the cuffs fell away, William stood slowly, his movements deliberate and composed. He adjusted his suit jacket and tie, with a calm precision that only heightened the tension in the room. His piercing gaze locked onto the chief, who now looked more uneasy than authoritative. "Perhaps you'd like to check my ID this time," William said, his voice low and firm, pulling his badge from his pocket. He slid it across the table, watching as the officers paled while reading the bold title, State's Attorney. The realization hit like a thunderclap. The officer's earlier bravado evaporated, replaced by a stumbling chorus of apologies. "Sir, we didn't know," one began, only to be silenced by a sharp glare from William. The chief cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. "Mr. Harper, this is an unfortunate—" "Save it," William interrupted, raising a hand. His tone was cold, final. Without another word, he turned and walked out, the clamor of reporters and the blinding flash of cameras awaiting him like a storm. He didn't flinch as the questions rained down, his stride steady and unbroken. Behind him, the interrogation room fell into an uneasy silence, its occupants realizing they had just made the mistake of a lifetime. By morning, the story was everywhere, on TV screens, social media feeds, and the front pages of major newspapers. State attorney wrongfully arrested, a case of racial profiling, became a rallying cry. The footage of William Harper, impeccably dressed, yet handcuffed and humiliated, juxtaposed against the revelation of his identity, ignited outrage across the state. Hashtags like #Justice for William and #End Racial Profiling trended nationwide, amplifying calls for accountability. Protests erupted in front of the precinct, drawing people from all walks of life. Signs reading "No Justice, No Peace," and "Stop Racial Profiling" bobbed above the growing crowd as chants echoed through the streets. News outlets documented the mounting tension, while the precinct faced unrelenting scrutiny. Public outcry demanded not only the suspension of the offending officers, but systemic changes to prevent similar incidents. Amid the chaos, William Harper stood before a sea of cameras and reporters in a poised but emotionally charged press conference. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice steady but firm. "It's about every person of color who has been judged, mistreated, or denied their dignity simply for existing in spaces others think they don't belong. This has to stop." His words resonated deeply, spreading far beyond the state's borders. Under mounting pressure, the precinct announced a slate of reforms. Officers would undergo mandatory anti-bias training, and disciplinary actions were initiated against the officers involved. But William didn't stop there. Using the momentum of the incident, he launched a statewide initiative to combat racial profiling in law enforcement, advocating for transparency and accountability. Meanwhile, the officers who had arrested him faced widespread condemnation. Their names and photos circulated online, their once proud careers teetering on the edge of ruin. At the end of the tumultuous week, William returned home. In the quiet of his living room, he handed his wife the necklace that had sparked it all. "It's a little late, but happy anniversary," he said with a wry smile. She embraced him tightly, her voice a mix of pride and worry. "You're changing things," she whispered. William looked out the window, the world outside buzzing with change. "One case at a time," he replied, his resolve unshakable.